Tonight, you'll walk through the frost-bitten world of the Vikings. A world carved from ice and shadow, where survival is a saga written not on parchment, but on the very soul of the land itself. Come closer to the fire, and listen. Forget the world you know, the constant light, the effortless warmth. We are going back. Back to a time when winter was not just a season, but a formidable god, a relentless hunter stalking the edges of civilization. Picture the scene. Above you, the sky is not a singular, empty black. It is alive. Ethereal curtains of green and violet. Light dance in a silent, cosmic ballet. This is the aurora, the Bifrost bridge of the gods, shimmering down upon a world held in a deep, crystalline sleep. The lights shift and sway, casting a ghostly glow on an endless expanse of ancient, dark forests. The trees, heavy with snow, stand like silent sentinels, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers towards the heavens. Their silence is profound, a quiet that seems to absorb all sound, creating a sense of immense and lonely majesty. This is the land of the north, beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Look beyond the forest's edge, out towards the great expanse of the sea. It is not the rolling, liquid ocean you might imagine. Here, the sea is a solid, fractured kingdom of ice. Great plains of white stretch to the horizon, a mosaic of jagged plates and frozen waves. You can feel the immense pressure in the air, the sheer, dormant power of a frozen ocean. The cold is not just a temperature, it is a physical presence. It seeps into your bones, sharp and clean, a constant reminder of nature's raw, untamable power. The very air you breathe seems to glitter with tiny, frozen diamonds. It is in this stark, unforgiving landscape that we will find our story. We will journey with the Norse people through the long, dark months of winter, and I will whisper to you of what is to come. We will explore the constant, gnawing search for food in a world where the earth is frozen solid and the game has all but vanished. We will feel the primal, sacred importance of the fire, not just a source of heat, but the very heart of the home, a beacon of life against the encroaching darkness, around which stories were told and communities were forged. We will uncover the ingenuity of their shelter. The Longhouse is built to withstand the howling gales and biting frost, creating a small pocket of humanity amidst the vast, cold wilderness. Most of all, you will come to understand the hard fight for warmth. It is a battle waged every single day, in every task. From mending a cloak to hunting a seal. Warmth was life. It was a bowl of hot stew, the breath of livestock in a shared space, the closeness of family huddled under furs. This is the story we will uncover tonight, not one of horned helmets and glorious battles, but a quieter, more profound epic of resilience, of endurance, and of the enduring human spirit's ability to carve out a life in the frozen heart of the north. The change did not begin with a storm. It began with a whisper, a subtle shift in the fabric of the world. It was a new sharpness in the morning air that stung the lungs, a different slant to the sunlight that no longer carried the warmth of summer but instead seemed thin and pale, as if filtered through ancient ice. By the time the first snows of October arrived, they were not a gentle surprise but a solemn confirmation of what everyone felt in their bones: the long dark was here. The flakes were not the soft, playful dustings of a milder climate, they were hard, determined pellets, falling with a purpose. They did not melt upon the earth but clung to it, a declaration of intent. Within days, the vibrant greens of the pastures and the deep browns of the tilled fields vanished beneath a stark, white shroud. Winter in the north was not a season that crept in, it was an invading army that arrived to conquer, and its first soldier was the snow. This initial blanket was just the beginning. The true siege was one of darkness. The sun, once a triumphant god, marching across the sky, became a weary, defeated old man. Each day, its arc grew shorter, its position lower and more southerly. It would struggle to climb above the jagged peaks of the fjords, casting long, distorted shadows that made the world seem alien and unfamiliar. Soon, it would only offer a few hours of weak, gray twilight before surrendering the world once more to the profound, unending night. This was not the simple darkness of a cloudy day. It was an oppressive, physical presence. It shrank the world to the small, flickering circle of a torch or the glowing heart of a longhouse hearth. To step beyond this ring of light was to be swallowed whole by a blackness so complete. It felt as if the stars themselves had been extinguished. This perpetual twilight had a profound effect on the spirit. It bred a unique kind of stillness, a quiet introspection, but also a deep-seated melancholy, a longing for a sun that seemed like a distant memory from another life. And then there was the wind. The wind of the northern winter was a living entity, a malevolent spirit that howled down from the glaciers and swept through the fjords. It was not a steady blow but a cunning, relentless attacker. It sought out every crack in the longhouse walls, every gap in a fur cloak. It carried the biting cold of the high peaks and the frozen sea, a cold that didn't just chill the skin but seemed to target the very marrow in your bones. It sculpted the snow into fantastic, monstrous shapes, called scavlar, sharp-edged drifts that could bury a path or a small outbuilding overnight. The sound of it was a constant companion through the winter months, a low moan that would build to a shrieking, insane crescendo. To the Norse, this wind was the breath of the Jotnar, the frost giants of myth. A constant, auditory reminder of the powerful, chaotic forces that ruled this frozen world, and of how small and fragile human endeavors truly were against them. In the valleys and along the narrow shores of the fjords, the rhythm of life underwent a dramatic and urgent transformation. The final days of pale light were a blur of relentless activity, a frantic race against the inevitable freeze. The last of the hardy grains, the oats and barley that had ripened in a brief, intense summer, were scythed and bundled, their stalks already stiff with frost. The work was hard, the ground unyielding, and every muscle ached with the cold and the hurry. This was the final gift from the soil, and not a single grain could be wasted. It was a time of communal effort, where every able-bodied person, from the oldest child to the stooped elder, had a role. The air, once filled with the scent of wildflowers and damp earth, was now thick with the smell of wood smoke and curing food. The fjord itself, the lifeblood of the community, offered its final bounty. Fishing boats, their timbers groaning in the icy water, made their last perilous trips. The catch was not for immediate feasting, but for preservation. Great quantities of cod and herring were brought ashore, their silver bodies stiffening almost instantly in the frigid air. The process of preparing them was a ritual passed down through generations. The fish were gutted, split, and tied in pairs by the tail, then hung on massive wooden racks called gel. There they would hang for months, slowly drying in the cold, relentless wind, untouched by flies or decay. The wind that chilled the people preserved their food, transforming the fish into a hard, protein-rich staple that would see them through the leanest months. It was a stark and beautiful sight, thousands of fish hanging like wooden effigies against the gray sky, a testament to foresight and toil. In the smokehouses, sides of pork and mutton were hung to cure over smoldering fires of alder and juniper wood. The fragrant smoke infusing the meat, protecting it from rot. In the cool, dark cellars dug into the hillsides, barrels were being filled. Salted meat, pickled vegetables, and tubs of butter and cheese were stored away from the frost. Every root vegetable pulled from the frozen ground, turnips, carrots, onions, was a treasure, carefully packed in sand or moss to last. This was not mere hoarding, it was a calculated act of war against the coming starvation. The size of the winter stores was the true measure of a chieftain's wealth and a family's chance of seeing the spring. The sounds of this period were of frantic, focused labor, the rhythmic chop of an axe splitting the last logs for the woodpile, the coarse scrape of salt being rubbed into hides, the low chatter of women packing barrels, their breath pluming in the cold air. As the last of the harvest was secured and the first deep snows made travel perilous, the great shift occurred. Life pivoted from the sprawling outdoors of the farmstead to the smoky, communal confines of the Longhouse. The great, heavy doors, decorated with carvings of dragons and serpents, were swung shut, not to be fully opened again for months. This act represented a profound change in existence. The world, which for half the year had been a landscape of fields, forests, and sea, now shrank to the dimensions of a single, long hall. It was a move from a life of agriculture and exploration to one of survival and introspection. The tools of the field were cleaned and put away, and the tools of the winter were brought out, the weaving looms, the carving knives, the needles for mending nets and clothes. The air inside grew thick with the smells of humanity, wood smoke, cooking food, unwashed bodies, damp wool, and the faint, sweet scent of the livestock that were often housed at one end of the building for their precious warmth. This retreat into shelter was mirrored in the world outside. The animal kingdom, too, was responding to winter's iron grip. The great migrations had long since passed, the skies were empty of geese, the coastal cliffs silent, their seabird colonies departed for warmer currents. The deer and elk, once scattered across the high plateaus, were driven down into the more sheltered, wooded valleys, their movement slow and deliberate to conserve energy. But it was the predators whose change in behavior sent the most chilling signal. The wolves, which in summer kept to the high, remote forests, content to hunt wild game, were now drawn by the scent of civilization. Their hunger, sharpened by the scarcity of prey in the deep snows, made them bolder. Their howls began to change, no longer a distant, mournful call from the mountains, but a closer, more menacing sound. They could be heard at night, a hungry choir. At the edge of the firelight, their calls echoing across the frozen fjord. They were no longer just a part of the wilderness, they were a nightly presence, a pack of intelligent, starving hunters testing the boundaries of the human settlement, their yellow eyes watching from the darkness just beyond the reach of the flames. Their proximity was the most primal sign of all. The desperate time had truly begun. The Longhouse now became the entire world, a single, elongated vessel navigating a frozen sea of winter. Stepping inside was to be reborn into a different reality, one defined by smoke, shadows, and the press of life. The air itself was a thick, living thing, layered with the pungent smells of damp wool, human sweat, the sweet, earthy scent of the livestock quartered at one end for their vital body heat, and the ever-present, acrid bite of wood smoke. A constant haze hung in the high rafters, escaping slowly, if at all, through a simple hole in the roof directly above the central fire pit. This smoke, while stinging to the eyes and harsh on the lungs, was a necessary consequence of the one thing that mattered above all else: warmth. The interior was a realm of deep shadows and flickering orange light. The long, open hall was flanked by raised wooden platforms that served as both seating during the day and communal beds at night. Families had their own allotted spaces, marked by intricately carved wooden posts or chests holding their few worldly possessions, creating tiny islands of privacy in a vast ocean of community. At the very heart of this microcosm, both physically and spiritually, burned the long fire. It was more than a simple hearth, it was the sacred, beating heart of the home. It was never allowed to die. To let the fire go out was to invite death and darkness into the hall, a superstition rooted in the grim reality of a world without matches or lighters. Rekindling a flame from scratch in the damp cold was an arduous task, so the fire was carefully tended, banked with peat and ash at night to smolder, and brought back to life each morning before the first hint of gray twilight appeared. This central fire dictated the rhythm of life. In its light, food was cooked in a great cauldron suspended from the rafters, its bubbling stew a promise of sustenance. By its glow, all indoor work was performed. Around its heat, the community gathered, its flames reflecting in their eyes, warding off the profound chill of the world outside and the deeper chill of isolation. It was a beacon, a gathering point, a crucible in which the bonds of family and clan were forged and tempered through the long, dark months. This was not a time of hibernation, but of intense, focused industry. The enforced confinement of winter was the season of craftsmanship, a period when the Norse turned their energies inward to create, mend, and prepare. 4. The women, the dominant sound was the rhythmic clack-clack of the warp-weighted loom. Standing for hours, they would expertly weave the wool sheared from their own sheep into the dense, durable cloth known as vadmal. Essential for making and mending the cloaks, tunics, and blankets that stood between them and the killing cold. Needles of bone would flash as they worked, their hands never idle. For the men, this was the time for wood and iron. The scent of fresh wood shavings would fill a corner of the hall as a man sat, knife in hand, patiently carving an intricate knotwork design onto a sea chest, or shaping a new axe handle from a piece of ash wood seasoned by the fire. Tools from the harvest were meticulously cleaned and sharpened, their edges honed for the spring thaw that seemed an eternity away. Fishing nets, torn by rocks or the frantic struggle of a large catch, were painstakingly repaired, each knot tied with practiced skill. This was also the time of the mind and the spirit. With the physical world constricted, the world of stories and sagas expanded to fill the void. In the evenings, as the wind howled its mournful song outside, the skald, the keeper of the clan's history and myths, would hold the hall captive. With the firelight illuminating his face, he would recite the great epic poems, tales of gods and giants, of heroic voyages to distant lands, and of the deeds of their own ancestors. The children, wide-eyed, would listen, absorbing their history, their morality, and their identity not from books, but from the living voice. Elders would teach the young the secrets of the runes, carving them into small pieces of wood, explaining their meanings for guidance or magic. Music was a vital thread in this tapestry of survival. The mournful, resonant notes of a talharpa or the high, clear melody of a bone flute would drift through the smoky hall, a shield against despair, a way to express a longing for the sun, and a reminder of the beauty that could still be found in the heart of the darkness. Life in these close quarters was a delicate balance between community and conflict. With dozens of people sharing a single space for months on end, tempers could fray. A perceived slight, a dispute over a ration of food, or the simple annoyance of constant proximity could simmer into resentment. Privacy was a forgotten luxury. Yet, this intense cohabitation also forged unbreakable bonds. Shared hardship fostered a deep-seated reliance on one another. The survival of one was inextricably linked to the survival of all. This interdependence was the bedrock of their society. And winter was its ultimate test. They learned to read each other's moods, to give space when needed, and to come together in moments of fear or sorrow. The world outside the thick timber walls remained a constant, menacing presence. The roar of the wind, the heavy thud of snow sliding from the roof, the distant, hungry howl of a wolf, these sounds permeated the Longhouse, reminding them of their fragile position as a small pocket of warmth. And life besieged by an empire of cold. Occasional, swift forays into the blizzard were necessary, a dash to the Woodpile for more fuel, a check on the shivering livestock, each trip a brutal, breathless reminder of the elements. They had walled out. Yet, it was not all grim endurance. As the darkness reached its absolute peak, when the sun was barely a rumor on the horizon, the Norse prepared for a blaze of defiance, the midwinter feast of Yule. This was the pivot point of the year, a moment of profound ritual and celebration. Preparations would begin weeks in advance, lifting the spirits of the hall. The best of the stored meats were brought out, and special ale that had been brewing for months was tapped. A great log, the Yule log, was chosen and brought into the hall, its burning a symbol of hope and the sun's eventual return. For a few days, the strict rationing was relaxed. There would be feasting, drinking, song, and sacrifice to the gods, to Odin for wisdom, to Thor for protection, and to Freyr for the fertility of the land that now slept under a deep blanket of snow. Yule was more than a party, it was a collective act of faith. It was a celebration held in the very teeth of the darkness, a testament to their belief that the cycle would turn, that the light would vanquish the dark, and that their struggle through the long, frozen night would ultimately bring them, once again, to the promise of spring. To truly understand the heart of the Viking winter, you must step across the threshold. You must leave the vast, silent, and blindingly white world of snow and wind behind and push through the heavy, rune-etched wooden door into the Longhouse. The transition is not gentle, it is a profound and immediate shock to the senses. The first thing that hits you is not the warmth, but the air itself. It is thick, heavy, and alive. A dense cloud of wood smoke, smelling richly of peat and resinous pine, fills the space from your chest to the high, soot-blackened rafters. It stings your eyes, making them water instantly, and catches in your throat, forcing a cough that feels impossibly loud in the sudden enclosure. Your vision, accustomed to the stark glare of sun on snow, is momentarily lost in the deep, perpetual twilight, a gloom pierced only by the flickering, dancing light of the central fire pit. It takes a long moment for shapes to emerge from the shadows, for the world to resolve itself from a murky dream into a living reality. Then, the warmth envelopes you. It is not the clean, dry heat of a modern home but a damp, primal warmth, thick with the breath of life. It seeps into your frozen skin and stiffened joints, a feeling so welcome, so deeply yearned for, that it borders on painful pleasure. The cold, which has been your constant companion for months, begins its slow retreat from your bones. And with the warmth comes the sound. The howling fury of the wind outside is instantly muted, replaced by an entirely new symphony. The dominant sound is the constant, gentle crackle and hiss of the fire. But beneath it lies a subtle and continuous chorus of creaks and groans from the building itself. The massive timber beams that form the skeleton of the Longhouse are not static, they are in a constant, slow dialogue with the winter outside. Under the immense, crushing weight of the snow on the sod roof, the wood complains with deep, resonant groans. When a powerful gust of wind slams against the turf brick walls, the entire structure shudders, and the timbers whine in response. To live in the Longhouse is to live inside a great wooden beast, to feel its ribs expand and contract with the pressures of the frozen world, a constant, living reminder of the fragile barrier between your warmth and the elemental chaos it holds at bay. As your eyes fully adjust to the gloom, you become aware of the other inhabitants of this ark. The Longhouse is not a space reserved for humans alone. At the far end of the hall, often separated by only a low wooden partition or a simple change in the earthen floor level, are the animals. To the modern mind, the idea of sharing one's home with cows, goats, and sheep seems impossibly strange, yet for the Norse, it was a fundamental strategy for survival. Your ears pick up their gentle, domestic sounds, the the soft, rhythmic chewing of cud, the low, contented lowing of a cow, the occasional impatient bleat of a goat, the rustle of hay as they shift their weight. And with the sounds comes the smell. An earthy, pungent aroma of livestock and damp straw that weaves itself inextricably into the scent of wood smoke. And cooking food. It is a smell that speaks not of filth, but of life and wealth. These animals were not mere beasts of burden, they were living furnaces. Their collective body heat, trapped within the insulated walls of the Longhouse, could raise the ambient temperature by several crucial degrees, making the difference between shivering and relative comfort. Their warm breath misted in the cool air, a visible sign of the heat they contributed to the shared space. In this symbiotic world, the humans gave the animals shelter from the lethal cold, and in return, the animals gave the humans their warmth, their milk, and the promise of future security. They were a living, breathing insurance policy against the brutal winter. The layout of the human space was dictated by practicality and the unyielding hierarchy of warmth. The most desirable areas were those closest to the long fire, the great, smoldering hearth that ran down the center of the hall. Life was lived on wide, raised platforms of earth or wood that flanked this central fire pit. These platforms served as benches for sitting, working, and eating during the day, and transformed into communal beds at night. The concept of sleep was a far cry from modern solitude and comfort. It was a communal, strategic huddle for survival. The preparation for the night was a well-practiced ritual. First, a layer of dried heather or springy straw would be laid down upon the wooden platforms to provide a modest cushion against the hard earth and to insulate from the ground-level cold. Upon this base, heavy, hand-woven woolen blankets, known as feld, were spread. But the true key to surviving the night's deep chill was the furs. These were among a family's most prized possessions, the thick, shaggy pelt of a bear, the sleek and surprisingly warm hide of a wolf, or the supple skins of deer, stitched together. Families would sleep together, arranged to maximize shared body heat, with the youngest children nestled securely in the middle, cocooned between their parents and siblings. There was no privacy, only the shared, rhythmic breathing of a dozen or more people. In some longhouses, the chieftain or head of the family might have a lokrekja, or locked bed closet. This was not a separate room, but a carved, wooden box bed built against the wall, often with sliding or hinged doors. While offering a shield from drafts and a sliver of privacy, its primary purpose was still the concentration of warmth, creating a small, easily heated pocket of air for its occupants. To sleep in a longhouse was to be constantly aware of the presence of others, a foot jostling yours, the sound of a cough in the darkness, the murmur of a sleeper lost in a dream. It was an intimacy born of pure necessity, a nightly affirmation that in this frozen world, survival was a collective, not an individual, endeavor. The darkness was near absolute once. The fire was banked for the night, a profound blackness broken only by the faint, deep red glow of the dying embers. At the heart of the hall, the fire was the master of the house, and its demands were absolute. The final act of every single evening, long after the last story was told and the sleepers had settled into their furs, was the ritual of banking the embers. This was a task of immense importance, often falling to the matriarch of the family. With careful, practiced movements, she would use a stone tool to push the glowing coals into a tight, dense mound at the center of the hearth. This precious core of heat was then gently covered with a thick layer of ash, a gray blanket that would starve the embers of just enough air to prevent them from burning out, yet allow them to retain their intense inner heat. This act, known in other lands as the curfew from the French couvre-feu or cover fire, was a sacred trust. It was the promise of warmth for the coming morning. The first conscious act of the following day, undertaken in the deepest, coldest part of the pre-dawn darkness, was the fire's resurrection. The woman would approach the silent hearth, her breath misting in the frigid air of the hall. She would carefully scrape away the insulating ash, revealing the faint, deep red glow of the live embers within, like a dragon sleeping in its hoard. Into this glowing heart, she would place the most delicate, driest tinder, a piece of birch bark, a tuft of dried fungus, or finely shredded flax. Leaning in close, she would gently blow, her own breath, giving life back to the flame. A tiny wisp of smoke would be the first sign of success, followed by a flicker, then a small, hungry flame that would greedily lick at the tinder. She would nurture it, feeding it progressively larger. Kindling, twigs, wood shavings, and finally, a split log. Only when the fire was once again stable, a crackling, breathing entity casting its light and life back into the hall, could the day truly begin. This daily cycle of covering and reviving was the unwritten law of the Longhouse, a fundamental rhythm more important than the rising of the sun, for in the depths of winter, the sun was a distant abstraction, but the fire was life itself. Once the fire was reborn, the day's slow, deliberate pulse could begin. Suspended over the flames from a heavy chain was the great iron cauldron, the stomach and soul of the household. It was rarely empty. Into this pot went the substance of their survival. The day's main meal, often the only hot meal, was a perpetually evolving pottage known as skayus. It was less a specific recipe and more a living history of the larder. The base might be water or thin broth, into which chunks of dried cod, reconstituted by the simmering heat, were added. Slivers of salted mutton or pork would contribute richness, alongside hearty root vegetables from the cellar, turnips, onions, and carrots. Handfuls of barley or oats would thicken the stew, making it a substantial, energy-rich meal. New ingredients were added as the cauldron's contents were ladled out, ensuring there was always something to eat. The smell of this simmering pottage was the defining scent of the day, a constant, savory promise of sustenance. The gathering for this meal was the day's central social event. Families would sit on the benches, holding wooden bowls, the steam from the hot stew warming their faces as they ate. Time itself was measured by this routine, not in hours and minutes, but in the slow, steady rhythm of the fire's needs and the single, communal meal that punctuated the long stretch of indoor work. As the brief, gray twilight outside faded back into the impenetrable black of the afternoon, the second, and perhaps most important, phase of the day began. The physical labors of mending and carving would often continue, but the focus shifted from the hands to the mind. This was the time for stories. With the world outside utterly erased by darkness, the people would gather closer to the fire, its light pushing back the shadows and the deep-seated human fear of what they contained. An elder, or a traveling skald prized for his memory, would begin to speak. The performance was not theatrical or loud, it was often a low, rhythmic chant, a mesmerizing cadence that wove itself into the crackling of the fire and the moaning of the wind. The flickering light would cast his face in a dramatic play of shadow and glow, holding every listener captive. The tales they told were the very fabric of their culture. They were a living library, an oral encyclopedia of what it meant to be Norse. The skald would recite the great sagas, tracing the lineage of the clan back through generations, reminding every person in the hall of their ancestors, their obligations, and their place in the world. They would tell the complex, morally ambiguous tales of the gods, of Odin's relentless, self-sacrificing quest for knowledge, of Thor's simple, brute force protection of the human world from the chaos of the giants, and of Loki's cunning tricks, which often brought disaster but sometimes unexpected boons. But not all stories were of gods and heroes. They told Cautionary tales to enforce social norms, stories of the Draugr, the malevolent undead who guarded their burial. Mounds, a terrifying reminder to respect the dead and their property. They shared folklore, riddles, and proverbs. Each one a lesson in wisdom, wit, or practical knowledge. This was not idle entertainment. This was the primary vehicle for education, for the transmission of history, law, religion, and morality. For the children huddled in the firelight, these stories populated the oppressive winter darkness with meaning, providing a framework to understand their world and a powerful affirmation of their shared identity against the vast, unknowable emptiness outside their walls. The Longhouse, therefore, was far more than a physical shelter. It was a psychological fortress, engineered to defend its inhabitants against the mental ravages of the long dark. The unrelenting monotony, the lack of sunlight, and the severe confinement could easily lead to a state of despair and lethargy the Norse knew as hut sickness. Every aspect of their indoor life was, consciously or not, a defense against this ailment. The rigid daily routines, reviving the fire, the single communal meal, the hours of purposeful craftwork, provided structure and a sense of accomplishment. The constant, necessary tasks left little time for brooding. The stories and chants provided mental stimulation and reinforced social cohesion, reminding everyone that they were part of a larger, ongoing saga. Even the creaking of the house timbers served as a reminder that they were not alone, but were inside a strong, sheltering entity. To survive the winter was to survive not just the cold and hunger, but the assault on the human spirit. And so they endured, huddled in the smoky warmth of their hall, listening to the slow chant of a story and the ceaseless howl of the wind. They existed in the heart of a paradox, utterly confined and cramped, yet deeply connected to their history, their gods, and each other, living a small, fragile, and fiercely protected pocket of human order in the midst of a vast and beautiful desolation. In the saga of the Viking winter, survival was a story told in layers. Warmth was not a commodity to be bought or a switch to be flipped, it was a fortress to be built, a personal shelter constructed thread by thread, piece by piece, upon one's own body. The clothing of the Norse people was not a matter of fashion or vanity, but a form of meticulously engineered armor. Its primary function was not to impress the eye, but to defy the elements. In the relentless war against the cold, a well-made tunic or a sturdy cloak was as vital as a shield in battle, and the needle was as mighty as the sword. Every stitch, every textile, every layer was a calculated defense against the insidious enemy that could freeze the very marrow in your bones. To understand how they survived is to understand how they dressed, beginning with the most fundamental transformation of all, turning the raw fleece of a sheep into a bastion against the frost. The journey of a garment began in the flickering firelight of the Longhouse, with a task that was as constant as it was essential: spinning. After the summer shearing, the raw wool, greasy with lanolin, tangled with bits of leaf and dirt, was cleaned and then carded. This process involved combing the fibers between two wire-bristled paddles, a repetitive motion that untangled the fleece and aligned the fibers into a soft, airy puff called a rollag. This prepared wool was the raw material for the spinner, almost always a woman, who would spend countless hours of the long winter turning this fluffy mass into strong, continuous yarn. Her primary tool was the drop spindle, a deceptively simple device consisting of a wooden shaft weighted by a stone or clay whorl at the bottom. Seated on a bench near the fire, she would draft a small amount of fiber from the rollag, attach it to the spindle, and give the whorl a sharp twist. As the spindle spun, suspended in the air, it introduced a twist into the fibers, locking them together to form thread. Her hands worked in a fluid, ancient rhythm, one hand managing the supply of wool, the other controlling the tension and guiding the twist. It was a hypnotic, time-consuming process. The low, humming sound of the spinning spindle was a constant feature of the Longhouse winter, a quiet sound of productivity against the howling of the wind outside. Hour after hour, day after day, the spun yarn would be wound onto the spindle shaft until it was full, then transferred to a larger bobbin. It took an immense amount of yarn to create a single garment, meaning that spinning was not a chore to be completed, but a state of being for much of the year, the foundational craft upon which all warmth depended. Once enough yarn had been painstakingly produced, the next stage of creation began at one of the most impressive pieces of technology in the Longhouse, the warp-weighted loom. This was not a small, portable frame, but a massive, upright structure of heavy timber beams that leaned against one of the main walls. Its scale was a testament to the importance of its function. The vertical threads of the weave, the warp, were tied to the top beam and stretched down towards the floor. Instead of being tied to a bottom roller, however, each group of threads was passed through a hole in a loom weight, a heavy, donut-shaped stone or piece of baked clay, which held them taut under the force of gravity. The sight of a fully warped loom was a thing of beauty and order, a forest of hundreds of parallel threads, each held in perfect tension by its own weight, the stones hovering just above the earthen floor. The weaver, again, typically a woman, did not sit. She worked on her feet, walking back and forth along the width of the loom in a slow, deliberate dance. In one hand, she held a shuttle, a boat-shaped piece of wood carrying a bobbin of the weft yarn. She would pass this shuttle between the warped threads, from one side to the other. Then, she would pick up her weaving sword, a long, heavy, and smooth batten made of wood or whalebone. With a series of sharp, upward thrusts, she would beat the weft thread tightly up against the previously woven cloth. Thump. 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 The sound was solid, rhythmic, and deeply satisfying. It was the sound of a wall being built, a barrier being forged. This process was physically demanding, requiring strength in the arms and shoulders and the endurance to remain on one's feet for hours. The result of this strenuous labor was vadmal, a distinctively thick, dense, and slightly coarse woolen fabric. The tight weave and the natural lanolin remaining in the wool made it remarkably wind-resistant and water-repellent, an ideal material for the harsh northern climate. With the cloth finally made, the process of constructing a garment could begin, guided by a philosophy of layering that was both simple and profoundly effective. The Norse understood that the greatest insulator was not fabric itself, but trapped air. Multiple layers of clothing created pockets of air between them, which would be warmed by the body and held in place, forming a personal shield of heat. This system began with a surprising choice for the layer directly against the skin. It was not wool, but linen. Linen, produced from the fibers of the flax plant, a crop cultivated in the short summer months, is not known for its insulating properties. However, it possesses a different quality that was even more critical for a base layer. It is hydrophilic, meaning it absorbs moisture and wicks it away from the body. And it dries relatively quickly. In the extreme cold, sweat is a killer. Damp skin loses heat at a terrifying rate, and a damp woolen undergarment would remain wet, clammy, and cold. The linen undershirt or shift acted as a crucial moisture management system, keeping the skin dry and preventing the rapid loss of body heat from perspiration during strenuous work like chopping wood or walking through deep snow. The primary insulating layers were built on top of this linen foundation. These were the garments made from the thick, durable vadmal that they had worked so hard to produce. For a man, this typically consisted of a simple tunic, long-sleeved and falling to the mid-thigh, worn over a pair of woolen trousers. These trousers were not loose or baggy but were cut for a snug fit to conserve warmth and allow for easy movement. For a woman, the main garment, was a long woolen dress or kirtle, often sleeveless, which would be worn over a long-sleeved linen underdress. Over this, she would wear a rectangular, apron-like garment called a smoky or hangrock, held up by two straps that went over the shoulders and were fastened at the front with large, often ornate, disc brooches. These brooches were not just decorative, they were functional pieces of hardware that held the entire outfit together. The patterns for these clothes were simple and efficient, designed to waste as little of the precious, labor-intensive fabric as possible. They were stitched together using needles crafted from polished bone or bronze, and thread made from strong linen yarn. Or, for tougher materials like leather, sinew taken from the tendons of deer or cattle. The stitches were sturdy and functional, made to endure years of hard wear in a world where a failed seam could mean dangerous exposure to the cold. The woolen tunic and trousers formed the core of the Vikings' defense, but the true shield against the biting fury of the wind was the outer layer, the cloak. This was typically a large, rectangular piece of the heaviest and densest vadmal cloth they could produce, and it was a masterpiece of versatile simplicity. By day, it was a walking shelter. A man would wear it draped over his shoulders, fastened on his right shoulder with a large, strong pin or brooch made of iron, bronze, or even silver for the wealthy. This placement kept his sword arm free and unencumbered, a practical consideration in a turbulent world. The sheer weight and thickness of the fabric created an formidable barrier against the wind, preventing it from stealing the precious warmth trapped in the layers beneath. In a sudden snow squall, the wearer could pull the cloak's edge up over his head to form an impromptu hood, hunkering down and turning his back to the gale, the heavy wool shedding the snow effectively. At night, whether in a strange hall or caught in the wilderness, the cloak became a warm and familiar blanket. It was a constant companion, a multi-purpose tool that was arguably the most important single garment a Viking owned. The amount of labor embodied in a single cloak, from shearing sheep to spinning yarn to weeks at the loom, made it an object of immense value, a significant part of a person's wealth. For those who could afford it, or for those who were skilled enough hunters to procure it, the ultimate layer of warmth was fur. Fur was nature's perfect insulator, and the Norse people, living in close proximity to the wild, were masters of its use. It was applied as lining for cloaks, boots, and mittens, or worn as a garment in its own right. The type of fur used was not only a matter of practicality but also a clear and powerful statement of status and identity. A hunter might wear the skin of a fox, its soft, dense fur providing incredible warmth for its light weight, often used to trim the edges of a hood where its softness would touch the face. The skin of a wolf was a different matter entirely. To wear a wolf pelt cloak was to wrap oneself in the spirit of the quintessential northern predator, a symbol of ferocity, cunning, and resilience in the face of winter. It was a garment that commanded respect and spoke of a dangerous prowess. At the apex of this hierarchy of skins was the bear. The hide of a great brown bear was an object of immense power. Incredibly thick, heavy, and unimaginably warm, a bearskin cloak was a portable shelter, a veritable wall of fur that could defy the most extreme temperatures. But it was far more than functional. It was the ultimate status symbol, a clear proclamation of the wearer's strength, courage, and high standing. Only a great chieftain, a revered leader, or a legendary warrior of the berserker tradition could claim such a prize. Other animals provided specialized materials as well. The hide of a reindeer, whose hairs are hollow, offered exceptional insulation, making it prized for boots and mittens. Along the coast, the skin of a seal, naturally oily and water-resistant, was the perfect material for making boots and outerwear for those who had to face the damp chill of the sea spray. This bestiary of warmth was a Testament to the Vikings' deep understanding of their environment, using the attributes of each animal to strategically build their defense against the cold. This intricate system of layering would be for naught if the extremities were neglected. Frostbite was a constant, crippling danger, and protecting the hands, feet, and head was a matter of life and death. Footwear consisted of simple but effective boots, typically made of tougher leathers from a cow or the water-resistant hide of a seal. The real secret to their warmth, however, was on the inside. They were often lined with soft rabbit fur or, more commonly, stuffed with insulating material. This could be a wad of felted, matted wool, or even dried grass or moss, which would be packed into the boot around the foot, creating a thick, cushioned barrier against the frozen ground. To further protect the lower legs and secure their trousers, men would wear winingas, or leg wraps. These were long, narrow strips of woolen cloth, often woven in a decorative herringbone pattern, which were wound tightly from the ankle up to just below the knee and secured with small hooks or by tucking in the ends. These wraps provided an extra layer of insulation, supported the leg, and prevented snow from getting into the boots. Hands were protected by mittens, usually made of wool or leather and lined with fur. The designs were often simple, with a pouch for the 4 fingers and a separate stall for the thumb. This design was a compromise, allowing for basic tasks like gripping a tool or a rein, while keeping the fingers together to share warmth. A Viking would never venture out in the depths of winter without a covering for his head. This could be a simple wool or fur cap, or more commonly, a hood. Hoods could be attached to a cloak or made as a separate garment with a short mantle covering the shoulders, providing a seamless seal against wind and snow creeping down the neck. When fully outfitted, clad in layers of linen and wool, wrapped in a heavy cloak, feet shod in fur-lined boots, legs wrapped, hands mittened, and head hooded, a Viking was transformed. They became a self-sufficient mobile unit, a figure of formidable resilience, capable of moving and functioning in a landscape that would kill an ill-prepared person in minutes. In this world, clothing was never disposable. The sheer amount of human energy invested in every single garment made it a precious resource to be conserved and respected. A tunic was not discarded when it tore, it was meticulously repaired. A patch of a different color might be sewn over a hole, creating a mosaic of use and care. A child's tunic would be made with extra long sleeves that could be rolled up, and a deep hem that could be let down as they grew. When a garment was truly worn beyond repair, it was not thrown away. It entered a new phase of its life. It might be cut down to make a smaller garment for a child, or torn into strips to be rewoven into a new, multicolored fabric. The most worn-out pieces could be cut up for leg wraps, used as cleaning rags, or serve as the stuffing for a leather ball for children's games. The finest garments, like a chieftain's ornate cloak or a prized bearskin, were treated as heirlooms. They were handed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, becoming a tangible link between generations. To wear your father's cloak was to be wrapped in his strength, his memory, and his legacy. These clothes were imbued with the stories and the spirit of those who had worn them before, a physical chronicle of a family's journey. They were a testament to the skill of the spinners and weavers, the prowess of the hunters, and the resilience of a people who not only survived but thrived in the frozen north, armored not in steel, but in the enduring warmth of wool, fur, and generational ingenuity. Chapter 4, Food in the Freezing Months. If clothing was the Vikings' armor against the external cold, then food was the internal fire that fueled their very existence through the long, dark winter. The battle for warmth was fought on 2 fronts, and the struggle for calories was every bit as desperate as the fight to keep the frost from one's skin. The victory or defeat of a household over the winter months was determined not in a single, heroic moment, but in the slow, monotonous, and disciplined management of their larder. The winter pantry was not a place of culinary delight, it was a fortress of preservation, a carefully amassed arsenal against the siege of starvation. Every barrel of salted fish, every slab of wind-dried meat, every crock of fermented vegetables was a testament to the foresight and relentless labor of the brighter months, a cache of stored sunlight and life to be rationed out in the endless gloom. To open the door to this cellar or pantry was to be met with the powerful, unglamorous perfume of survival. Imagine descending the stone steps into the cool, dark cellar, the air thick with the sense of earth and preservation. The dominant smell was often of the sea, a sharp, pungent brine emanating from massive wooden barrels. Inside these, packed in coarse salt, lay the silver hoard of the fishing season, thousands of herring, their bodies pressed tightly together, their scales still retaining a dull shimmer in the torchlight. In another barrel, larger, paler fillets of cod, salted and preserved, awaited their turn in the stew pot. This was the protein backbone of the winter diet, a seemingly endless supply that was nonetheless counted and portioned with extreme care. Hanging from the rafters above were the fruits of the autumn slaughter. Great haunches of mutton and sides of pork and beef, looking more like dark, petrified wood than meat, hung stiff and cold. This was skirpikjat, meat that had been cured not by smoke, but by the relentless, dry northern wind, which wicked away all moisture, leaving behind a hard, intensely flavorful, and nearly indestructible source of sustenance. To eat it required soaking it for hours, or slowly simmering it back to a semblance of its former state. Further into the cellar, another set of barrels held the treasures of the soil. Great quantities of cabbage, shredded and pounded with salt, had fermented into a Viking version of sauerkraut, its sharp, sour tang a welcome and vital counterpoint to the salt-heavy diet, providing crucial nutrients in the absence of fresh greens. Crocks of pickled beets and other hardy vegetables stood alongside them. In the driest corners, sacks of barley, rye, and oats, the hardy grains of the north, were piled high, their dusty scent a promise of bread and porridge. There were also sacks of dried peas and beans, adding bulk and protein to the winter stews. And in the coolest section, protected from the deepest frost, lay the root vegetables, turnips, onions, and hardy carrots, their earthy smell grounding the sharper sense of salt and fermentation. Shelves would hold the hard, pale wheels of cheese, and tubs of butter and skyr, a thick, tangy cultured dairy product. This was the household's treasury, a meticulously gathered collection of life, each item representing a victory over decay, a defiance of winter's decree of barrenness. The daily culinary ritual centered around the Longhouse's ever-present cauldron, bubbling eternally over the central hearth. Here, the art of cooking was not one of complex recipes, but of slow, patient extraction. The day's meal was rarely created from scratch, but was instead a continuation of the day before in a process known as the perpetual pottage, or skyuse. Into the simmering remnants of yesterday's stew, new life would be added. A handful of salted herring or a chunk of dried meat, first soaked to remove the harshest salt, would be tossed into the pot. Then came the chopped turnips and onions from the cellar, their sharp flavors mellowing as they cooked. The most vital ingredient, however, was bone. No animal bone was ever wasted. After the meat was stripped, the bones were thrown into the cauldron to simmer for days on end. The constant, low heat would break down the collagen, rendering the broth thick and gelatinous, and more importantly, it would draw out every last vestige of fat and nutrient from the marrow. This wasn't for flavor, it was a non-negotiable act of resourcefulness, ensuring that every single calorie the animal had to offer was consumed by the family. The resulting meal was not a clear soup, but a thick, sludgy, and hearty pottage, a monotonous but life-sustaining slurry that filled the belly and provided a blast of warmth. While the contents might vary slightly from day to day, the character of the meal remained largely the same throughout the winter. Bread was a more laborious affair, and therefore a greater treat. The process began with the back-breaking work of grinding grain on a quernstone, a simple rotary hand mill. A woman would kneel, feeding handfuls of barley or rye into the top stone and turning it, producing a coarse, gritty flour. This flour was mixed with water or whey and kneaded into a stiff dough. Baking was done on a hot, flat hearthstone laid at the edge of the fire, producing dense, unleavened flatbreads that were chewy and filling. On special occasions, or in households with a dedicated outdoor clay oven, risen loaves could be baked. The smell of baking bread, a rare and wonderful aroma that momentarily overpowered the sense of smoke and damp wool, was a profound luxury, a reminder of bounty in a season of scarcity. Meals themselves were solemn, quiet affairs. As the brief day faded, the family would gather on the benches in the flickering light of the fire and a few precious tallow candles or simple lamps burning fish oil. The clamor and joy of a summer feast were gone, replaced by a focused, almost reverent silence. Food was not to be taken for granted. Each spoonful of the hot, bony stew, each bite of the dense, dark bread was a conscious act of refueling, of pushing back the gnawing cold and hunger for another few hours. The silence was punctuated only by the crackle of the fire, the scrape of wooden spoons against wooden bowls, and the ever-present moan of the wind outside the longhouse walls. To wash it down, they drank what was available. There was the milk from the goats who shared their shelter, often served warm. For the adults, there was ale, the dark, smoky beer brewed from their own barley, a staple of the diet that provided calories and hydration. And on the coldest nights, or for a special occasion, a horn of hot mead might be passed around. This sweet, fermented honey wine, spiced with herbs, would send a welcome fire through the veins, a sweet and potent defiance of the bitter world outside, a fleeting taste of summer's gold in the heart of the long, dark winter. But the most meticulously planned pantry has a bottom. The true test of the Viking winter began when the rhythm of rationing gave way to the frantic calculus of scarcity. It started with subtle changes. The scoop, once plunged into a barrel of herring, would scrape against the wooden bottom sooner than expected. The slab of dried meat taken from its hook would be the last of its kind. The daily portion of grain for the cauldron would be measured with a slightly lighter hand. A quiet anxiety, cold and sharp as the wind outside, would begin to permeate the smoky air of the longhouse. The solemn silence of the meals would take on a new, more desperate edge. Every chew was slower, every swallow more deliberate, as each member of the family tried to extract the maximum sensation of fullness from a dwindling resource. The conversations would die down, the storytelling would become less frequent, as the collective energy of the household turned inward, focusing on the single, gnawing question that echoed in the pit of every stomach: will there be enough? When the answer threatened to be no, they turned to the frozen world outside, not for a bounty, but for scraps. This was not the hopeful harvest of autumn, but a grim and desperate forage. Bundled in their layers, individuals or small groups would venture out into the stark, white landscape, their eyes scanning for any sign of life, any anomaly in the snow. They would dig with gloved hands or sharpened sticks at the base of trees where the snow was thinnest, searching for hardy roots that might have survived the deep freeze. More often than not, they would find nothing but frozen earth. They would scan the wind-blasted rocks for patches of lichen, the hardy, crust-like organism known as reindeer moss. They would scrape it off, its texture dry and brittle in the cold, and take it back to the longhouse to be boiled into a bitter, unappetizing sludge that offered minimal nutrition but could, for a time, fill an empty belly. The true mark of desperation was when they turned to the trees themselves. Not for fruit, not for nuts, but for the very bark that protected the wood. They knew that beneath the rough outer bark of trees like the pine or birch lay the cambium, a thin, inner layer that carries nutrients for the tree. In times of plenty, it was not considered food. In the depths of a famine winter, it was a lifeline. They would strip this inner bark and boil it for hours, attempting to break down the tough fibers and release the meager starches within. The resulting substance was a stringy, resinous paste that was difficult to swallow and tasted of pine needles and desperation. To be reduced to eating bark was to stand on the very precipice of starvation, consuming the forest's bones because all its flesh was gone. When the foraging yielded nothing, when the last of the bark stew had been choked down, the people turned their eyes to the unthinkable. This is where the sagas fall into hushed tones, where the chronicles speak of wolf winters. So brutal they tested the very definition of what it meant to be human. The stories of hunger from these times are grim. Every scrap of leather in the Longhouse became a potential meal. An old belt, the worn-out soles of shoes, any piece of hide would be meticulously scraped clean and then boiled for days. The goal was to break down the tough, tanned skin into a gelatinous, glue-like substance that could be swallowed. It was a phantom meal, providing almost no nutritional value but tricking the stomach with a fleeting sense of fullness. They hunted creatures they would normally spurn, mice in the walls, crows, anything that moved. And in the darkest tales, from the most severe famines, there are whispers of the ultimate taboo. The sagas don't often speak of it directly, but hint at it in stories of Draugr, the Walking Dead, and men who turned into trolls in the wilderness. Some scholars believe these stories may be a cultural memory of times when communities were forced to make the most horrifying choices, when the dead were no longer seen as ancestors to be revered, but as a final, terrible resource. When a neighbor's fire went out for good, the desperate might look upon that silent Longhouse not with sorrow, but with the grim calculation of survival. This was the true horror of the Viking winter, not the monsters of myth, but the monster of hunger that lived inside every person, a beast that could compel them to break the most sacred laws of kinship and community just to see one more sunrise. This prolonged starvation took a terrible toll on both body and mind. The inner fire, deprived of fuel, began to burn low. A deep, profound lethargy would settle over the inhabitants of the Longhouse. Movements became slow and deliberate, every action calculated to conserve a few precious calories. The body, in its wisdom, begins to shut down. The mind narrowing its focus to a single, obsessive point, food. All other thoughts, of stories, of crafts, of the gods, faded into a dull background noise. The complex social fabric of the clan would begin to fray under the immense strain. Tempers would shorten, old resentments would flare, and the communal trust that was the bedrock of their society would be eroded by suspicion. A person's worth could be reduced to what they consumed versus what they contributed. Even the simple act of drinking became a matter of survival. When the last of the ale and mead was gone, water was the only option. But the streams were frozen solid. Every drop of water had to be won by melting snow or ice, a process that itself consumed precious firewood. A pot of snow would be set by the hearth, slowly, maddeningly, turning into a meager amount of water that would be shared among the thirsty. As the final days of winter dragged on, the Longhouse would grow quieter and stiller, its people moving like ghosts in the gloom. They were living archives of hunger, their bodies consuming themselves from within. They existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting, praying for the first sign of the thaw, for the return of the birds, for the single drop of meltwater from the roof. That signaled the end of their long, brutal, and hungry war with the winter. Chapter 5, Surviving Sea Voyages in Winter. The Longhouse was a fortress against the winter. The longship was a test of faith within it. A winter voyage was not an undertaking of exploration or commerce, it was an act of pure, grim necessity, a journey into the very heart of the northern desolation. No sane Viking chieftain would order his ships to sea in the freezing months for any reason short of absolute desperation. The call might come as a summons to war from an allied jarl, an obligation that could not be ignored. It could be a desperate winter raid on a distant shore, a final, high-stakes gamble for food when the larders were empty and the specter of famine loomed over the clan. Or it could be the only option for fleeing a powerful enemy, choosing the near-certain perils of the frozen sea over the absolute certainty of slaughter at home. Whatever the cause, to cast off the mooring ropes in winter was to voluntarily leave the world of men and enter a hostile, mythological realm where the sea and the sky conspired to produce a cold so profound it could extinguish life with indifferent ease. The moment the ship cleared the protective embrace of the fjord and met the open sea, the world changed. The relatively calm, sheltered water gave way to a violent, chaotic swell of black, icy waves. The wind, no longer baffled by mountains, hit the ship with the force of a physical blow, carrying a chill that seemed to pass through wool and leather as if they were smoke. The true enemy, however, was the water itself. Every wave that crashed over the bow, every sheet of spray kicked up by the wind, brought a new layer of winter's assault. The water was so cold that it froze almost on contact. The deck, a familiar platform of sturdy timber, quickly became a treacherous, uneven skating rink of frozen sea spray. A thick crust of rime would grow over every surface, the gunnels, the thwarts, the intricately carved dragon head on the prow, encasing the vessel in a brittle, white shell. This ever-accumulating ice was a relentless foe. It had to be constantly chipped away with axes and mallets, a brutal, exhausting task. If left unchecked, the sheer weight of the ice could make the ship dangerously top-heavy and sluggish, threatening to capsize it in a heavy swell. The rigging, the ship's vital system of ropes and lines, suffered just as terribly. The thick, tarred ropes that were pliable in summer became as stiff as iron bars, coated in a thick, crystalline layer of ice. Every line creaked and groaned under the added weight, and the sound of ice crackling and splitting in the rigging was a constant, unnerving chorus. The great, square sail of woven wool, already heavy, would become saturated with freezing spray, turning it into a monstrously heavy, frozen board that was incredibly difficult to manage. A simple command to reef the sail in a rising gale became a life-threatening, monumental struggle against an opponent made of ice and gravity. It was in this environment that the sailors had to work, their bodies pushed to the absolute limits of endurance. The most agonizing battle was fought by their own hands. The task of managing the frozen rigging, of tying and untying knots with numb fingers, was a unique form of torture. Woolen mittens, while essential, would quickly become soaked. The water would then begin to freeze within the fibers, encasing the hands in stiff, icy claws. To perform any task requiring dexterity, the mittens often had to be removed, exposing bare skin to the wind and the frozen ropes. The pain was immediate and excruciating, a searing, burning sensation that quickly gave way to a profound, terrifying numbness. Fingers lost all feeling, becoming clumsy, useless appendages. Tying a critical knot felt like fumbling with frozen sticks of wood. The sailors would resort to using their teeth and their whole body weight to pull lines taut, their hands having failed them. Every maneuver was a gamble, a race against the moment when the cold would render them completely incapable of the tasks needed to keep the ship afloat. Their only defense against this onslaught was the armor they wore, the same layers of wool and hide that protected them on land, but now tested in a far more extreme arena. The outermost layer was the most critical. Ideally, this would be a cloak or tunic made of oiled leather or, even better, sealskin. The natural water resistance of these materials provided the best possible shield against the constant spray, allowing the water to beat up and run off, rather than soak in. Underneath this, the layers of dense woolen vadmel did their work, trapping body heat. But on a longship in a winter storm, staying dry was an impossibility. A single large wave, crashing over the side, could drench a man to the bone in an instant. This was the moment of greatest peril. Once the inner woolen layers were soaked, a man's own clothing became his worst enemy. There was no escape from it. The wind would whip at the wet fabric, and the process of freezing would begin. He could feel his tunic stiffening, his trousers turning to boards of ice against his skin. The garment was no longer an insulator, it was a conductor, actively leaching the precious heat from his body, a cage of ice that he could not remove. This is what made the winter voyage so uniquely terrifying. On land, a fire was the answer to all things cold and wet. In the Longhouse, a man could strip off his wet clothes and huddle by the hearth, letting the blessed heat restore him. On the open deck of a wooden longship, fire was an unthinkable impossibility. There was no hearth, no external source of warmth whatsoever. The only fire was the one that burned within each man's own body, the metabolic furnace, fueled by the food he had eaten. Their survival depended entirely on their inner heat, on the calories they could burn. To counteract the relentless, draining power of the frozen, wet world around them. Every shiver was a tremor of that inner fire sputtering, and every man on board knew that if that fire went out, there would be no way to relight it. To keep their inner fires from being extinguished, the men had to consume fuel, but there was no comfort to be found in the ship's provisions. The stores for a winter voyage were chosen for two qualities alone, caloric density and resistance to decay. There were no simmering cauldrons here, no hot stews to warm the hands and belly. Food was a cold, hard necessity, consumed with grim purpose. The staple was often dried fish or skirpikjot, the same wind-dried meat from the larder, but now it seemed impossibly harder, colder. A man would gnaw on a piece of it for an hour, his jaw aching with the cold and the effort, the raw, salty taste doing little to please the palate but providing the vital protein and fat needed to generate heat. Alongside this, they had hardtack, a simple, unleavened bread or biscuit made from barley or rye flour and water, baked until it was stone hard. It was durable and calorie-dense, but eating it was a chore, requiring strong teeth and a moment of submersion in the near-freezing water of the drinking barrel to make it remotely chewable. Water itself was a challenge. Stored in barrels, it was punishingly cold to drink, a shock to the system that seemed to steal warmth even as it quenched thirst. In the coldest spells, a skin of ice would form on the surface, needing to be broken before a cup could be dipped. There was no hot ale or mead to lift the spirits, such luxuries were for the Longhouse. Here, sustenance was stripped of all pleasure, reduced to its most elemental function. It was a stark equation understood by all, the energy expended battling the ice and the rigging had to be replaced, or the bodies. Fire would begin to consume itself, starting a countdown from which there was no return. Every bite of hard bread, every stringy fiber of dried meat, was an act of defiance, a small deposit of fuel made against the relentless withdrawals demanded by the cold. The physical hardship was matched by a profound psychological ordeal, most acutely felt during the periods of thick, snowy fog. When the fog rolled in, the world vanished. The horizon, the waves, the sky, all were erased, replaced by an oppressive, silent, and featureless gray. The ship seemed to hang suspended in a void, the only reality being the ice-caked timbers underfoot. Sound was swallowed by the snow-laden air. The roar of the wind softened to a muffled moan, the crash of the waves became a dull thud. The world shrank to the length of the ship, a ghostly vessel sailing through an endless purgatory. In this white silence, the men would retreat deep inside themselves. There was no idle chatter, no singing of sagas to pass the time. To speak felt like a violation of the profound silence, and a waste of precious energy. The crew existed in a state of stoic, insulated misery. Each man was an island, locked in his own private battle with the cold, the fear, and the crushing monotony. His world was the rasp of his own breathing, the ache in his bones, and the rhythmic creak and groan of the ship's timbers, the only sounds proving that the world had not ceased to exist entirely. This environment was a crucible for the mind. It bred a deep, unyielding patience and a mental fortitude that is hard to comprehend. They were not merely traveling, they were enduring, waiting for the world to reveal itself once more. The silence was not peaceful, it was heavy, laden with the unspoken anxieties of being lost, the constant threat of a collision with an unseen rock or iceberg, and the grim knowledge of their own fragility within this immense, indifferent emptiness. In this state of extreme, prolonged cold, death was not a dramatic, violent visitor. It was a quiet, insidious thief. It came for the man whose inner fire was already burning low, the one who had perhaps shipped a larger wave than the others, or whose mitten had torn, or who was simply older and had fewer reserves. The first sign was the cessation of shivering. While violent shivering was agonizing, it was the body's desperate, life-affirming attempt to generate heat. When it stopped, the battle was being lost. A strange lethargy would overcome the victim. He would grow quiet, listless. He might answer questions with a slow, confused murmur or not at all. Then came the terminal stage of hypothermia, a cruel paradox where the brain, starved of heat and oxygen, malfunctions and creates a sensation of intense warmth. A man might be seen trying to fumble with the fastenings of his frozen cloak, convinced he was burning up, even as his core temperature plummeted to fatal levels. There was no ceremony for such a death. The other crew members, their own emotions frozen numb, would watch with a grim, fatalistic acceptance. They knew there was nothing to be done. To try and warm him would be to waste their own precious, dwindling heat. Once life had slipped away, the man became a problem to be solved. His body, stiffening in the cold, was a dead weight the ship did not need. His clothing, however, his woolen tunic, his sealskin cloak, his boots, was an invaluable resource. With a brutal but necessary pragmatism born of pure survival instinct, the crew would strip the body of these garments to be given to whoever needed them most. Then, without a prayer or a final word, they would roll their former comrade over the side into the black, waiting water. The sea would take him instantly, and the ship would sail on. Every man knew this was the rule. Survival belonged to the living, and sentimentality was a luxury none of them could afford. To navigate this white hell was perhaps the greatest testament to their skill. With the sun and stars, their primary guides, hidden for days behind a thick veil of cloud and snow, they relied on a deeper, more intimate knowledge of the sea. They read the direction of the long, rolling ocean swells, which held their course far better than the chaotic, wind-driven waves. They observed the flight patterns of the few hardy seabirds that braved the winter ocean, knowing which species stayed close to shore. They tasted the salinity of the water and felt its temperature. They could discern the loom of a coastline long before it was visible, a subtle change in the air and the wave patterns. If the clouds parted for even a moment, a navigator might use a sunstone, a piece of calcite or another birefringent crystal, to find the sun's position even when it was below the horizon or obscured, a feat of near magical skill. The first sighting of land was not met with triumphant cheers. It was received with a profound, collective exhalation of breath, a release of tension so deep it left the men feeling hollowed out. The sight of the dark, snow-dusted cliffs was the end of the ordeal, the confirmation that they had crossed the abyss and would live. As they guided the ice-encrusted ship into a sheltered bay, the men moved like ancient, weary figures. They were gaunt, their faces chapped raw by the wind, their eyes holding the vacant, haunted look of those who have endured the unendurable. They had sailed through the white silence and survived, but the cold and the quiet of that journey were now a part of them, a frozen memory carried in their bones that would never truly melt away. In the great, silent theater of the Viking winter, the central actors were not the people themselves, but the elemental forces they sought to master, the fire that gave warmth, the wood that fed the flame, and the tool that bridged the gap between the man and the forest. The story of winter survival is fundamentally a story about energy, and the vast majority of that energy was stored not in barrels of grain, but in the heartwood of the ancient forests that surrounded their settlements. Long before the first snowflake fell, another, equally vital harvest had to be undertaken. This was the wood harvest, a frantic, preemptive war waged against the coming cold. In the crisp, golden light of autumn, the forests would echo with the rhythmic, percussive sound of the axe. It was a community-wide mobilization, a race to fell, split, and stack a mountain of firewood sufficient to last through months of relentless frost. Every man knew that the first deep snow would blanket the forest floor, making it nearly impossible to haul heavy logs, and freezing the wood solid, turning the act of splitting it from a strenuous task into a Herculean struggle. The size of a settlement's woodpile was as clear an indicator of its chances of survival as the fullness of its larder. This was not a thoughtless clear-cutting of the forest. The Vikings were intimately connected to their environment, and their approach to wood was that of a master craftsman selecting his materials. They possessed a deep, generational knowledge of the trees, understanding that each species offered a unique set of gifts. For the sacred, life-giving fire, they sought out the dense hardwoods that would provide the most heat for the longest time. Oak was the undisputed king. Its heavy, tightly grained wood burned slow and hot, producing a bed of long-lasting, glowing coals that was perfect for banking the hearth fire at night, ensuring a live ember could be found in the morning. Birch was another prized firewood. It burned hot and bright, and its remarkable, paper-like bark, rich in flammable oils, could be peeled from the tree even when wet and used as a superlative fire starter. Other trees served different, but equally vital, purposes. The tall, straight pines and firs were the backbone of their infrastructure. While they burned too fast and sparked too much to be ideal for the main hearth, their long, straight trunks were essential for building and repairs. When a winter gale damaged a section of the Longhouse wall, it was a straight pine timber that would be used to mend it. The strong, flexible wood of the ash tree was the preferred material for the hafts of their tools, their spears, and most importantly, their axes. They understood its ability to absorb shock without splitting. The forest was their wooden treasury, a library of resources where each tree was a volume containing specific solutions for the problems of survival, warmth, shelter, tools, and repairs. Their relationship with the forest was not one of conquest, but of a deep and respectful understanding of its utility. At the very center of this world of wood and work was the axe. To the Viking, the axe was not merely a tool, it was a partner in survival, an extension of their own will to live. It was the indispensable object that made everything else possible. The typical Norse axe was a masterpiece of functional design, most often a bearded axe, where the lower edge of the blade extended downwards, providing a wider cutting edge while keeping the tool light and balanced. The head was forged iron, and the haft was hewn from strong, shock-absorbent ash. In the hands of a skilled woodsman, the axe was an instrument of incredible versatility. Its primary role was felling trees, the powerful rhythmic swings biting deep into the trunk, each thud a heartbeat in the forest's silence. Once the tree was down, the axe was used to limb the trunk and buck it into manageable lengths. Back at the Longhouse, the axe's role shifted. With a heavier head, it became a splitting tool, cleaving the rounds of wood into pieces suitable for the hearth, revealing the dry heartwood within. But its utility went far beyond brute force. By gripping the haft close to the head, a man could use the long beard of the axe for fine, controlled work. It could be used to hew a log into a square beam, its edge shaving away the wood with surprising precision. It could carve the joints for a new piece of furniture, shape a replacement ore for a boat, or even put a rough edge on a stake. For defense, the axe built the home, it felled the wood that warmed the home, it shaped the tools used in the home. And if necessary, it defended the home. It was so fundamental to a man's existence, so intertwined with his identity and ability to provide for his family, that it was often considered his most important possession, a trusted companion that would be laid to rest with him, ready for the work that awaited in the next life. All this labor, the felling, the splitting, the stacking, was in service of one ultimate goal, the creation and maintenance of fire. For a Viking, fire was not just a chemical reaction, it was a living, breathing entity, a domestic god at the center of the household. And its creation was a moment of practical magic. The most common method was with flint and steel. A man would hold a piece of flint, a hard, sharp-edged stone, in one hand. In the other, he held his fire steel, a C-shaped piece of carbon steel. Tucked between his thumb and the flint would be a small piece of tinder, most often char cloth, a piece of linen that had been charred in a sealed container until it was pure black carbon, capable of catching a spark at an incredibly low temperature. With a sharp, downward strike, the man would graze the steel against the edge of the flint. The hard stone would shave off microscopic particles of iron, and the friction of this act would heat them to incandescence, creating a brief, brilliant shower of sparks. The goal was to direct this shower onto the char cloth. Most sparks would die instantly, but with skill and persistence, one would land just right, and a tiny, orange ember would bloom on the black surface. There was no flame yet, only a single, growing point of heat. This was the seed of the fire. To bring it to life, the glowing char cloth was quickly transferred into a larger, prepared ember nest. This was a loose ball of the finest, fluffiest, and driest material available, shredded birch bark, fungus like amadou or tinder polypore, fine wood shavings, or the down from thistles. The man would cup this nest in his hands, bringing it to his mouth and blowing gently, steadily. His own breath, the spiritus of life, would feed the tiny ember, which would glow brighter, spreading through the tinder nest until, with a sudden whoosh, it burst into a small, hopeful flame. This nascent fire was then carefully placed into the hearth and fed with kindling, the beginning of the great, roaring blaze that would hold the winter's darkness and death at bay. The story of the Viking winter has thus far been one of physical endurance, a war fought with axes, needles, and stored provisions. But the final and most formidable battlefield was not the frozen sea or the snow-choked forest, it was the silent, boundless landscape of the human mind. The greatest challenge was not surviving the cold that seeped into the bones, but the profound darkness that threatened to extinguish the spirit. When the sun becomes a Fleeting, apologetic ghost on the horizon, and the world is plunged into 22 hours of unrelenting night, the very fabric of reality begins to fray. This was the ultimate test, a siege fought not against an external enemy, but against the internal phantoms of despair, isolation, and madness that bred in the endless gloom. To survive this required more than a warm cloak and a full belly. It required a mind armored in myth, a spirit warmed by song, and a worldview that could find meaning in the heart of the abyss. The sheer, oppressive weight of the darkness is difficult for the modern mind to truly comprehend. 4 months on, and the day was a mere footnote to the night. The sun, when it appeared at all, was a low, weak, and distant smear of blood-orange light in the southern sky. It offered no warmth and did little to truly illuminate the world, casting long, distorted shadows that made the familiar landscape seem alien and menacing. After a few short hours of this spectral twilight, it would slip away, abandoning the world once more to the absolute sovereignty of the night. This prolonged deprivation of light had a profound physiological and psychological effect. It created a deep, physical lethargy, a hot sickness where the limbs felt heavy and the will to move was sapped. Time lost its rhythm, becoming a thick, stagnant river of darkness, measured only by the rituals of stoking the fire or ladling out the daily meal. The world outside the flickering circle of firelight began to feel less and less real, a place of myth and memory rather than a physical space. The greatest danger was a slow, creeping despair, a quiet surrender to the belief that the light and life of summer would never return. Into this physical and psychological void, the Norse cosmology projected a universe of living, breathing entities. The darkness was not empty, it was populated. The long winter nights were the domain of supernatural forces, a time when the veil between the world of humans, Midgard, and the other realms grew perilously thin. The land itself had its own guardians, the Vlandvetter, and in winter these spirits could be seen as hostile, resentful of the humans huddled around their fires on the frozen earth. But the more immediate fears were of the creatures who thrived in the cold and dark. This was the season of the Jotnar, the frost giants from Jotunheim, whose chaotic and destructive nature was made manifest in the brutal realities of winter. The howling of the wind was the breath of a giant, an avalanche on a distant mountain was the sound of its footstep, and the crushing cold was the physical embodiment of its ancient, implacable hatred for the world of gods and men. On a more intimate scale, the darkness held the threat of trolls, malicious creatures of the wilderness who lurked in caves and among the dark pines just beyond the firelight. To venture out of the Longhouse alone on a winter's night was to risk being snatched, a fear drilled into children from their earliest years. The winter nights were also the time of the dead. The Norse believed in the Draugr, the animated corpses of the dead who jealously guarded their burial mounds. These were not ethereal ghosts, but solid, physical beings of immense strength, filled with a venomous hatred for the living. The fear that a Draugr, driven by a cold and ancient malice, might come to the door of the Longhouse was a very real and terrifying possibility. And weaving through all of this was the wolf. The starving wolf pack whose howls drew ever closer to the homestead was a real, physical threat, but it was also a powerful symbol. It was a living echo of Fenrir, the monstrous wolf destined to swallow the sun and the moon at Ragnarok, the final cataclysmic end of the world. In the endless dark of winter, it felt as though Ragnarok was not a distant myth, but a creeping reality that had already begun. To withstand this psychological siege, the Vikings deployed their own forms of spiritual defense. One of the most powerful was the human voice, raised in song. In the oppressive silence of the Longhouse, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the moan of the wind, singing was an act of profound defiance. It was a declaration of life, warmth, and humanity against the cold, in human emptiness. These were not always songs of joy. They could be slow, droning, hypnotic chants, forms of gald or magical incantation, that were believed to have a protective, warding effect, creating a sonic wall against the evil spirits that lurked outside. They sang work songs, their rhythms guiding the monotonous tasks of grinding grain or weaving cloth, transforming drudgery into a collective, moving meditation. They sang songs that recounted their lineage, reminding themselves of their ancestors who had survived these same winters, reinforcing their own place in a long chain of endurance. To sing was to prove you were still alive, to warm the soul when the body was cold, and to fill the darkness with a sound that was purely and defiantly human. This was layered upon their most powerful mental armor, their mythology. The stories of their gods were not just entertainment, they were a psychological framework that gave meaning to their suffering. Their struggle was not a random, meaningless ordeal. It was a reflection of the cosmic struggle. They could look out at the frozen world and see it as the domain of the frost giants, and in their own fight for survival, they were allied with Thor, the great defender of Midgard, whose hammer was the bane of giants. When they battled the frozen sea, they were in the realm of the treacherous sea giant Aegir. The foreknowledge of Ragnarok, the prophecy that the world would end in a final, terrible winter followed by the destruction and rebirth of all things, was not a source of despair but, paradoxically, a source of profound strength. It taught them that struggle, hardship, and even utter annihilation were woven into the very fabric of existence. Their own winter was a small echo of the great Fimbulwinter that would precede the end. This meant their suffering had purpose, it was a reflection of a divine, cosmic battle, and to endure it with courage was to live an honorable life, worthy of the gods themselves. This heroic framework allowed the Norse to bridge the vast gulf between the grim reality of their lives and the glorious promise of their faith. A man tending goats in the smoky confines of the Longhouse, his world shrunk to the smell of damp wool and animal dung, was not merely performing a chore. In his mind, he was a guardian, a protector of the resources that kept his family alive. He was a warrior in a different kind of battle. While the sagas sung by the firelight spoke of epic clashes with sea serpents and rival jarls, he was engaged in an equally vital, though quieter, struggle against famine and frost. The promise of Valhalla, the hall of the slain where heroes would feast and fight until the final battle of Ragnarok, was not exclusively for those who fell on a sword. It was for those who lived and died with courage. By facing the relentless, soul-crushing monotony of a winter's day with an unbroken spirit, by refusing to yield to the despair that the darkness offered, he was demonstrating the very fortitude that defined a hero. Each day he kept his family fed, each night he endured without madness, was a victory. His mundane reality was imbued with a sense of epic purpose. He was not just waiting for the winter to end, he was actively fighting it, earning his honor not with an axe against a skull, but with a stoic heart against a frozen world. Now, imagine all these pressures, the darkness, the fear of spirits, the crushing isolation, magnified tenfold. Imagine a world beyond the relative safety and society of the main Longhouse. Picture a lone farmhouse, a small, solitary hut occupied by a single family, miles from any neighbor and buried in a seemingly infinite ocean of snow. Here, the psychological battle reached its most intense and perilous pitch. There was no communal chorus of song to push back the silence, only the sound of one's own family, their voices seeming small and fragile against the vast emptiness. The fear of a troll or a wolf pack was not a shared anxiety to be discussed and mitigated by the strength of the clan, it was a personal, immediate, and terrifying threat. Every strange creak of the timber, every scrape of a branch against the turf roof, could be the footstep of a monster at the door. In this profound isolation, the greatest enemy was one's own mind. The silence was no longer a simple absence of noise but a living presence, a heavy blanket that could smother the thoughts. The darkness was not just outside the walls, it was a constant companion within them. The family members had only each other for company, a situation that could either forge an unbreakable bond or, under the immense strain, cause the tethers of kinship to fray and snap. To survive in such a place required a level of mental and spiritual self-reliance that was almost superhuman. The farmer was not just the head of the household, he was the sole keeper of the flame, the only warrior standing guard, the only skald to remember the stories, the only priest to appeal to the gods. His own spirit was the homestead's last and most important line of defense. If his hope faltered, the entire world would fail with it. Ultimately, the Norse people did not view this immense hardship as a meaningless cosmic cruelty. They saw the cold, the darkness, and the isolation as a profound spiritual test. Winter was the great crucible of the soul, a forge designed by the gods to burn away all weakness, vanity, and frivolity, leaving behind only the pure, hard essence of a person's character. It was a measure of their hamingja, a complex concept blending luck, honor, and spiritual power. To simply survive the winter was a base achievement. To endure it with one's spirit intact, to face the darkness without flinching, to perform one's duties to family and gods without complaint, and to emerge into the spring with one's honor untarnished, that was a victory of the highest order. The cold was a metaphysical grindstone, and the soul was the blade held against it. A weak soul would shatter. A strong soul would emerge. Sharper, brighter, and more resilient than before. This is how a farmer could be as noble as a king. It was not the glory of one's actions that mattered most, but the strength of the spirit with which one faced their ordained struggles. The winter was their adversary, and in enduring it with courage, they fought a battle worthy of the gods' attention. And after the long, brutal test, came the verdict. It did not arrive in a grand pronouncement, but in a series of small, sacred signs. It might be a subtle shift in the quality of the twilight, a barely perceptible lessening of the deep, oppressive blue. It could be a change in the sound of the wind, its mournful, despairing howl softening to a gentler whisper. But the most significant sign, the one that brought tears to the eyes, was the sound of a single drop of water falling from the snow-laden eaves of the Longhouse. That sound, the drip of melting snow, was the first note in the symphony of spring. It was the sound of the frost giants retreating, the sound of the world unclenching its frozen fist. Soon after, the first brave seabird would be spotted, a dark shape against the gray sky, its lonely cry a promise of the returning flocks. These were not mere seasonal changes, they were divine confirmations. They were the fulfillment of an unspoken promise that life would triumph over death, that light would banish the darkness, and that their monumental endurance had been seen and rewarded. The sun, when it finally climbed above the horizon with real warmth in its rays, was not just a star. It was a validation of their faith, a triumphant conclusion to their long, dark night of the soul, and a blessed resurrection for a people who had stared into the frozen abyss and refused to blink. Chapter 8, The First Signs of Spring. The end of the great northern winter did not arrive with a triumphant, sudden fanfare. It began not with a sight, but with a sound. It was a sound so small and insignificant that at first, it might be dismissed as a trick of the ear, a phantom noise in the deep, oppressive silence of the Longhouse. It was the sound of a single drop of water. After months where the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the moan of the wind, and the muffled cadence of human voices, this tiny, distinct plink as a droplet of meltwater fell from the snow-laden eaves to the damp earth below was as loud and momentous as a thunderclap. A person inside, mending a net or carving a piece of wood, would freeze. Their head cocked, listening. Was it real? Another plink. And then another, faster this time. Soon, a slow, irregular rhythm would establish itself, a liquid heartbeat confirming that the world's frozen slumber was ending. This was the first message from the world outside, a promise whispered in water that the siege was breaking. People would gather by the door, not even opening it, but just listening to that quiet, miraculous drumming, a sound more beautiful than any song. Following the sound, came the light. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible day by day, but profound over the course of a week. The sun, for so long a pathetic, ruddy smear on the southern horizon, began to climb. Its daily journey grew longer, its arc higher and more confident. The weak, gray twilight that had defined existence for months began to be infused with a silvery, then a pale golden quality. The light started to have substance again, it held within it the first, faint promise of warmth. Shadows, which had been long and distorted phantoms, began to shorten, to retreat. The world, for so long a stark, two-toned landscape of white snow and black rock, began to regain its depth and color. The brilliant, painful glare of the sun on the vast snowfields was different now, tempered by a new softness in the air. And with the returning light came the returning life. The first signal was often the piercing cry of a single seabird, a gull that had braved the elements to return to the coastal cliffs. Its call, sharp and wild, was a startling intrusion into the winter's silence, a herald of the great flocks that would soon follow. Then, smaller birds like the snow bunting, hardy survivors of the fringe seasons, would begin to sing their tentative, tinkling songs from the branches of the birch trees. For the people emerging from the Longhouse, these sounds were overwhelming. After a season of near sensory deprivation, the reintroduction of birdsong was a joyous cacophony, a confirmation that the world was not dead, that its life force was flowing back from some distant, warmer place. Each new call was a note added to the growing symphony of spring, a testament to the unshakable, cyclical nature of the world. The slow drip from the roof soon became a steady trickle, then a gurgling stream. The world transformed into a landscape of motion and sound. Rivulets of meltwater carved channels through the snow, revealing the dark, sleeping earth beneath. The great, silent plains of white began to shrink, pockmarked and rotten, surrendering their territory day by day. The sound of running water was everywhere, a constant, energetic murmur that replaced the wind's mournful howl. With this great thaw came a smell, an aroma so rich and profound it felt like an awakening in itself, the smell of damp, living earth. For half a year, the only smells had been of smoke, unwashed wool, and preserved food. This new scent, loamy, fertile, and full of potential, was the true perfume of life's return. It was the smell of the future, of the planting season, of renewed hope. In this world of mud, slush, and running water, the Vikings could finally reconnect with their land in the most fundamental way. There would come a day when a man or woman, stepping out of the Longhouse, would no longer be met with the unyielding, frozen hardness of the ground. Instead, their foot would sink slightly into soft, yielding mud. This was the moment for a ritual of quiet, personal joy. They would remove their worn, stiff leather boots, the moccasins that had been their prison for months, and for the first time since autumn, place a bare foot onto the soil. The sensation was a shock, the cold, wet squish of the mud between the toes, the direct, unmediated contact with the land. It was a grounding, an affirmation. This was their earth, no longer a hostile, frozen entity to be feared, but a living partner, awakening from its slumber, ready to provide once more. To walk barefoot on the newly thawed ground was to physically plug back into the lifeblood of the world, a simple, tactile pleasure that spoke of freedom and the end of confinement. But amidst this swelling tide of relief and sensory awakening, a moment of sober reckoning was required. Before the new season of work could truly begin, the final accounting of the old one had to be made. The head of the household would take a torch and unseal the door to the pantry or cellar, a place that held the ghosts of their winter anxieties. The air that wafted out was cool and stale, smelling of old brine and earthen floors. With a pragmatic, unflinching eye, they would take stock of what remained. This was the moment of truth, the final score in their long battle against starvation. How empty was the herring barrel? Was there but a thin layer of salted fillets at the bottom, or a more reassuring quarter left? How many shriveled turnips and onions remained in the root bin? How much grain was left in the heavy sacks, enough for a few more weeks of porridge, or a frighteningly small dusty residue at the bottom? This was a tense and private inventory. It was the measure of their foresight, their discipline, and their luck. To see a nearly empty pantry was to be confronted with a stark, visual reminder of how close they had flown to the sun, how near the abyss of starvation had truly been. There was an immense, bone-deep relief in the knowledge that they had made it, but it was a relief tempered by the chilling evidence of their vulnerability, a silent testament to the brutal efficiency of the northern winter. The stark reality of the depleted pantry lit a fire under the community more potent than any hearth. The brief, joyous respite of the thaw gave way to a period of frantic, back-breaking labor. The time for introspection was over, the time for production had begun, and it began with the earth. The fields, newly freed from their armor of snow and ice, were not yet the gentle, welcoming pastures of summer. They were cold, waterlogged, and heavy, a sodden, muddy battleground that had to be conquered before it would yield its bounty. The slow, deliberate pace of winter life exploded into a frenzy of activity. Men, gaunt but wiry from their winter ordeal, would lead the precious oxen, themselves weak from the lean months, out to the fields to be yoked to the ard, a simple scratch plow. The plowshare, often just a piece of fire-hardened wood, would bite into the wet, heavy soil, turning it over in thick, dark ribbons. The work was excruciatingly slow and physically demanding. When an ox was too weak, or if a family was not wealthy enough to own one, the men themselves would become beasts of burden, pulling the plow in a testament to their desperate urgency. Every member of the family had a role in this reclamation of the land. While the men steered the plow, women and children would follow behind, their hands plunged into the cold mud, breaking up the larger clumps of earth. They would walk the furrows, picking out the stones that the winter's frost heave had churned up to the surface. These stones, gathered by the cartload, would be used to mend the low stone walls that bordered the fields. Wicker fences that had been crushed by the weight of the snow were painstakingly repaired, a necessary defense against the incursions of wild animals and their own wandering livestock. The air, which for so long had been still and silent, was now filled with the sounds of this urgent work, the straining grunts of men, the lowing of the oxen, the shouts of encouragement, and the constant, damp thud of earth being turned. This was a race against an invisible clock, a desperate push to get the first precious seeds of barley, oats, and hardy vegetables into the ground, to begin the cycle of growth that stood between them and a repeat of the hunger they had just endured. As the fields were being awakened by force, a gentler, more joyful awakening was happening in the pastures and pens. The Longhouse, which had served as a multi-species ark through the winter, was now emptied of its animal occupants. The cows, goats, and sheep, blinking in the strengthening sunlight, were driven out onto the newly exposed ground, where the first tender, green shoots of grass were beginning to appear. This exodus was accompanied by a chorus of new life. The spring was the birthing season, a time of profound and tangible replenishment. The sight of a newborn calf, all long, wobbly legs and big, dark eyes, taking its first uncertain steps beside its mother, was a sight that could bring a smile to the most winter-hardened face. The pastures would soon be filled with the frantic, bleating energy of newborn lambs, leaping and frolicking in a pure, unadulterated expression of life's vigor. Small, nimble kids, the offspring of the goats, would climb every newly exposed rock and tussock of grass, their playful antics a source of endless amusement. Each one of these newborns was more than just a cute animal, it was a living, breathing symbol of renewed wealth and security. Each lamb was a future source of wool for their looms and meat for their larder. Each calf promised a future of strong draft animals and a supply of milk. The women would now spend their mornings milking the ewes and goats, the fresh, warm milk a sublime luxury after months of water and thin ale. It was a nutrient-rich gift that was especially vital for the children and for nursing mothers, a direct injection of life from the reawakening land. This explosion of new life was the gods' most visible blessing, a tangible sign that the cycle of fertility had returned, and a powerful guarantee against the famine of the next winter. The farmstead itself seemed to come alive in a new way. The great wooden doors of the Longhouse, sealed for months against the cold, were thrown wide open, allowing the spring air to finally flow through, chasing out the last of the winter's stale smoke and gloom. The people of the community, for so long confined to close quarters, emerged into the light, and the social fabric of the settlement was rewoven in the open air. The quiet, sometimes tense intimacy of the fire-lit hall gave way to a boisterous, open-air camaraderie. Laughter and shouting, sounds that had been muted for months, now echoed across the homestead. Neighbors who had only seen each other in the deep shadows of the Longhouse now worked side by side in the bright sun, their faces pale but their spirits alight. There was work to be done everywhere, a great communal effort of repair and preparation. Men would clamber onto the sod roofs, inspecting them for winter damage, replacing sections of turf that had been torn away by the wind and ice. Down by the water's edge, others would be tending to the boats. Fishing nets, painstakingly mended during the winter, were now brought out, their condition checked one last time before the first fishing expeditions. The longship, their vessel of trade, transport, and war, would be carefully inspected. Its timbers were checked for cracks, the hull retarred, and the rigging examined. This communal work was more than just practical, it was a social reset, a re-establishment of the bonds of cooperation and mutual reliance that defined their community, not in the cramped confines of survival, but in the expansive promise of the new season. When the most urgent work of planting was done, and the first flush of spring was undeniable, the community would come together for a final, profound act of closure and celebration. This was more than a simple party, it was a necessary ritual to mark the transition, a way to process the immense ordeal they had collectively endured. It often took the form of a spring blot, a feast and sacrifice to honor the gods who had seen them through. They would gather in the open air, a great fire roaring in their midst, its light now competing with a lingering, golden sunset. A chieftain or priest would lead the ritual, giving thanks to the gods, to Freyr, the god of fertility, for the new life in the fields and pastures, to Thor, for protecting their homes from the destructive forces of the winter giants, and to Odin, for the wisdom and foresight that had allowed them to plan and endure. An animal, perhaps one of the new lambs, might be sacrificed, its blood sprinkled on the people and the fields as a powerful symbol of the bond between the divine, the land, and the community. Then would come the feast. The food was simple, drawn from the first gifts of spring, fresh milk, cheese, and perhaps the last of the winter's ale, but it was the most satisfying meal of the year. As they ate and drank, they would look around at each other's faces. They could see the lingering shadows of hardship, the gauntness in the cheeks, the new lines etched around the eyes. But they could also see something else, an unbreakable, quiet pride. They had faced the ultimate test and had not been found wanting. They had stared into the abyss of the frozen dark and had held their ground. This shared experience forged a bond deeper than kinship. As they raised their horns to the sky, the toast was not one of arrogant victory, but of solemn, grateful endurance. It was a celebration of their resilience, a powerful affirmation of their own strength and spirit, and a confident, hopeful gaze toward the coming summer, ready to begin the cycle anew. O Utiro, the last ember. The fire crackles, and the world outside is still. The journey is over. Come closer, just for a moment more. Let the warmth soak into your bones. The saga is sung, the story is told, and the long night has finally given way to the day. For a little while, we walked together through a world of ice and shadow, a time when winter was not just a season, but a living god, a relentless hunter. We left our modern world of effortless light and warmth and stepped into the frost-bitten footsteps of the Norse people. And now, it is time to come home. Breathe deeply. Feel the simple, profound comfort of the quiet room, the steady heat of the fire. Let the echoes of the world we just left wash over you. Remember the feeling of the first snows, that silent, solemn declaration that the world was about to change. Remember stepping across the threshold of the Longhouse, into that smoky, crowded, living darkness that was both a sanctuary and a cage. You can almost feel the weight of the hand-woven wool, the layers of clothing that were their armor against the killing cold. You can almost taste the monotonous, life-giving pottage from the cauldron, and feel the deep, gnawing anxiety of a pantry slowly emptying. We stood on the deck of a longship as it crashed through black, icy waves, the spray freezing to the timbers, and we understood that here, the only fire was the one that burned within the human heart. We heard the lonely, rhythmic thud of the axe in the autumn forest, a desperate race for fuel. We saw the magic in a single spark struck from flint and steel, the birth of a flame that meant the difference between life and death. We felt the oppressive weight of a 22-hour night, and we imagined the shapes that moved in the darkness just beyond the firelight, the trolls, the spirits, the hungry wolves. We heard the songs and sagas they used to populate that darkness with meaning, to prove that they were still human, still hopeful. And we felt the turn. The exquisite, heart-stopping relief of the first drip of meltwater from the roof. The joy of seeing the sun return not as a stranger, but as a triumphant friend. The incredible, grounding sensation of a bare foot on thawed earth, a reconnection with a world reborn. You have walked a full circle of a season that few could now endure. You have felt the fear, the hunger, the cold, the isolation, and the profound, unyielding strength it took to survive. You have seen how a simple bowl of hot soup can be a sacrament, how a shared story can be a fortress, and how the human spirit, when tested, can burn brighter than any hearth. Look at the fire before you now. It is a gentle, comforting companion. But the last ember of that ancient, Viking fire still glows within it. It is the ember of resilience, of foresight, of community. It is the quiet understanding that warmth is precious, that light is a gift, and that survival is the bedrock upon which all other human endeavors, art, love, exploration, and knowledge, are built. The world we have just visited is gone, buried under 1,000 years of snow and soil. But the spirit that saw them through, that stubborn, unyielding refusal to surrender to the cold and the dark, is a legacy that has been passed down, a quiet strength that still resides in the deepest parts of the human soul. It is the strength that allows us to face our own long nights, whatever form they may take. The snow outside the window, if you imagine it, is melting. The struggle is over. The silence is no longer threatening, but peaceful. Tonight, you lived through the hardest season, and you made it home.